This is the second part of a rather specialized presentation regarding the German decision-making during the Battle of Smolensk in 1941. It concerns the radically different perspectives of the German Army High Command, or OKH, and the civilian authority, that is Hitler. For all intents and purposes, the OKH was determined to press on towards Moscow, while Hitler, through Armed Forces High Command, or OKW, ordered lateral advances to the north and south. This argument began in mid-July and wasn't settled until the end of August, when Hitler's perspective prevailed. As a result, the month of September could be argued to have been wasted, and with it the prospect of a quick victory over the Soviet Union. Was this delay a mistake? That's a widely argued perspective, and the books I'm looking at argue it wasn't a mistake, or at least did not constitute a significant delay. So if you're interested in this question, keep watching. In a twisted way, this is also an effort to rehabilitate the reputation of the German generals of World War II. For a long time, these generals were held in high regard among the military professionals, notably in the US and UK, as well as historians and even the general public. Their complicity in the less savory aspects of the regime they served reduced this somewhat. But in some of the more recent histories that I'm reviewing, the German generals have been chastised for their actual performance on the battlefield. In particular, this has been claimed about their opposition to the transfer of Army Group Center forces to the north and south after Smolensk during Operation Barbarossa. My goal here is to show that taking such a position with respect to the German generals creates an untenable tension in the argument that in any other context would readily discredit this claim. All right, let's look at Adam Tooze's book, The Wages of Destruction, which deals with the, well, so to speak, the making and breaking of the Nazi economy. It doesn't really cover the military aspect of the war very much, but he does discuss the period in question, and yeah, he's got some interesting things to say. Starting with, by the end of July 1941, all three German army groups had reached the feasible limit of their supply system and had halted their advance. The Red Army, though it had suffered devastating casualties, had not been destroyed. True. It was still fighting and inflicting serious losses. The situation was at its most critical in the central segment of the front line around Smolensk. Now, I want to point out here, again in defense of the German generals, they knew there had to be a pause as they built up their capacity to support further advances once they reached around Smolensk. And the other two army groups had not advanced as quickly or as far, and that was kind of the basis on which a lot of the problems arose. According to Tooze, it would be September at the very earliest before Army Group Center could resume an attack towards Moscow. And it's worth keeping in mind the footnote, the endnote that he provides here. Let's just have a look at that. The idea that there was a lost opportunity for Army Group Center to have advanced directly towards Moscow in August 1941, advocated principally by Franz Halder, both during and after the war, ignores the logistical constraints that prevented any kind of significant attack before mid-September 1941. And he references Van Creveld, Supplying War, which is another book I'll deal with. I think it's wrong. Van Creveld actually pulls a little bit of a fast one when he makes this argument. I think too much is being made of how long it would take. Tooze is right that this was precisely the kind of holdup against which Halder typo had warned so emphatically in his early assessment of the Barbarossa campaign plan. In early 1941, he had written that only uninterrupted speed preventing the Red Army from regrouping guaranteed success. And, again, Halder is right, and the German generals basically support that position. That's what a blitzkrieg is. I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot, but anyway, let's just carry on. Now, as early as the end of July, Hitler began to consider the possibility that the Red Army might not be destroyed in 1941. That's where Directive 33 comes in. On his instruction, Wehrmacht High Command issued a strategic directive openly acknowledging this possibility. Indeed, Hitler's moment of strategic realism appears to have gone further than this. It's funny because I'm not sure where the term starts with respect to Hitler's moment, but that's a reference. At some point I'm going to look up the moment of strategic realism, which is basically more or less making the claim that Hitler realized that he'd bitten off more than he could chew. There was no winning this war. Hence, everything that follows. Hitler seemed incapable of appreciating the kind of war that had succeeded for the Germans so far. He got very uptight about the way blitzkrieg warfare was fought. And he actually wasn't the only one. There were many generals who were nervous as the panzers would advance and lose contact with the infantry. He wasn't alone, but on the other hand, that was the kind of warfare that had brought all the success up to now. Anyway, ever since the first staff studies of Barbarossa, Hitler and the Wehrmacht High Command had assumed that if the initial assault failed to destroy the Red Army, strategic economic considerations would take priority. In other words, that a war of attrition is what would have to be prepared for if the Red Army wasn't destroyed early. This is I think what happens here with a lot of the authors that I'm covering here is they agree that basically we have to fight an attritional war now, and that's just it. It's stunning in my mind because there's no way that Germany can win a war against the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States at the same time. I mean, that's the resource difference is just overwhelming. And the problem with if there's a valid criticism about the German generals is that they tended to respond to this kind of pressure for economic gains, quick economic gains, was to delay and allow the forces to organically resolve the problem. In other words, win the battle. The forces would win the battles, and so the spoils that Hitler would go after, wanted so much, would fall into their hands. With Barbarossa, that meant going for Moscow, but they never wanted to challenge Hitler directly. They figured they could just have enough success that his big concerns about resources would be satisfied anyway. In August 1941, the fragile consensus that had underpinned the preparations for Operation Barbarossa broke down. As we have seen, Halder had always regarded the southern thrust into the grain lines of the Ukraine as a diversion from the real objective, the destruction of the Red Army in front of Moscow. Despite the fierce ongoing fighting at Smolensk, Halder still wanted to concentrate all available forces in the central sector for the earliest possible assault towards the Soviet capital. Absolutely. And the fact is, it wasn't just Halder. Every German general was in favor of this. So it really boils down to here that if you're taking the position that Halder is wrong, you're saying the German generals as a whole were wrong. And you're saying basically that Hitler knew better than the generals that he commanded on how to fight a war. think about that. Because that's essentially what this argument always boils down to. I don't know. I don't agree. However, as Tooze points out, rather than preparing for an offensive towards Moscow, which could at the earliest be launched in mid-September, yes, of course, it has to be mid-September. I think that's wrong. Again, I want to emphasize the politics involved, between the army on the one hand and Hitler and the government on the other hand. Their way of dealing with stuff, their way of dealing with objections was to say things like, well, they can't do it now, they don't have the logistics, they can't do it now, they're being attacked. It never stopped them when problems weren't happening, but it starts happening in August, in July, oddly enough, and it I don't know, to me it's very suspicious. But anyway, this recognizes the drive north and south. With regards to the turn and what comes afterwards, this is pretty much all that Tooze has to say. And you can tell me I'm wrong if you feel that I'm missing something. So now I'd like to look at Martin van Creveld, Supplying War Logistics from Wallenstein to Patton. It has a chapter on Operation Barbarossa, which is why we're going to look at it, and it has some interesting things to say. There is no doubt that the logistics situation would not have allowed an advance by Army Group Center on Moscow at the end of August. At the very best, a force of between 14 and 17 armored, motorized, and infantry divisions might have been so employed, and whether this would have been enough, even in September 1941, to break through the city's defenses is very much open to question. Now, it's very important to note here, by the way, because if you look at the end note that he's got there, 131, I looked it up, obviously. This is a reference to the number of divisions that the German quartermaster, I believe, says he's capable of supporting for an advance within the Army Group Center area of supply. But it's an entry dated July 15th. So I don't know how much improvement there was, but I would suspect that there was some improvement because obviously they had a lot more available. So it's a tough call. I don't actually agree with him. I think that he's using something from literally a month and a half prior as evidence to support a claim that they wouldn't have been able to get going before sometime in September. This is just a quick edit, trying to disprove Van Creveld's claim that there just wouldn't be enough forces available. So I looked up and found Halder's diary entry with reference to how many divisions could be supplied. I mean, this is basically your 14 to 17 forces. You'll notice that the options that are provided is 4 armored, 3 motorized, 10 infantry divisions for an operational group for offensive in the general direction of Moscow or in a southeastern direction. Again, this is from July 15th, so there's a lot of wiggle room because Van Creveld uses this as a basis for, as I've mentioned, he's using this as a basis for arguing that there's no hold-up as a result of this operation to the south. Well, this is July 15th and this is what they think they can support. And the other options are 4 armored, 4 motorized, 6 infantry, 6 armored, 4 motorized, and 3 infantry, so 14 to 14. So 14 low number of divisions, 14, so heavy on the armor. Light on the armor, 17. So it's how many infantry divisions do you want to provide for? Now it's worth keeping in mind, and this is what I forgot to mention, is the amount that's being discussed here is based on the table of organization strength. And in all probability, many of these divisions were really not up to their full strength. And worth keeping in mind, those same divisions, weakened as they were still the ones that advanced towards Moscow ultimately in October. I think they could have done that in September, and quite possibly, because again, you're looking at the operation to the south. It didn't begin until September, and you have to wonder about the dynamics, the decision dynamics here. I think Haller was deliberately trying to slow the process in hopes that Army Group South would advance enough to satisfy Hitler's expectations and thereby eliminate this need to send forces south, and therefore he'd have them in position ready to go for Moscow. And so I think Haller himself was creating a delay in any kind of a move. Guderian certainly blamed him for that after he folded and gave in to Hitler's expectations. So just a little side note I wanted to make. Carrying on, it is arguable, moreover, that since the approaches to Moscow were less suitable to mobile warfare than was the Ukraine, not even Panzer Group II could have been supplied. By preventing Guderian from being sent to Kiev, OKH would have spared his tanks much wear and tear and perhaps made it possible to speed up the replenishment of Second Army. The main forces of Army Group Central would not have been affected, however, for their supplies came through another rail line. And that's actually true, I believe. The performance of this line was such that even as late as 26 September, fuel stocks for Army Group Center were actually falling. The delay imposed by Hitler's decision to give the Ukraine priority over Moscow was therefore far shorter than the usual estimate of 6 weeks. The postponement, if there was one, he points out, can hardly have amounted to more than a week or two at the very most. I think he's reaching by making these claims. When you look at all of the factors involved, this just somehow doesn't ring true. I find it hard to believe that they'd be unable to somehow or other move forward, regardless of how terrible their situation was, because that seems to be a recurrent theme in the German military's fighting capacity, is that they somehow or other just seem to pull off these things. I think to have a clear understanding of how these things were achieved, hopefully somebody will take a deeper dive into the logistics, because on the paperwork level, they shouldn't be able to do. I totally agree with the authors I've looked at, that they shouldn't be able to accomplish what they've accomplished, but they do, and they keep doing it. And they keep doing it in November. And, if Stahel's more recent book is to believe, they kept doing it even when they were supposedly being defeated by the Soviet counteroffensive in the winter. So, yeah, I think I think Van Creveld was reaching with trying to minimize that delay. I think the delay was pretty big, and I think that's the impression you get. Everybody picks on Haller, but I mean, Haller kept a diary, and the ebbs and flows. If you've read some of the diary, I mean, there's a lot of ebb and flow, a lot of frustration, some sarcasm. I mean, it's actually a good read, if you have the time. So, moving right along. Since the Wehrmacht that set out to conquer Russia in 1941 was a poor army with strictly limited resources, success, from the logistic point of view, depended above all on a correct balance between railways, wheels, and tracks. A detailed scrutiny of the logistical system, as well as the plain fact that the German victories of 1941 were among the greatest of all time, seemed to indicate that, by and large, this balance was achieved, and that the solution which was actually adopted was probably the best possible. And you got to respect Van Creveld for putting that in print, because it basically emphasizes that, yeah, the German generals were not fools, and they weren't ignorant of the realities they were faced with. They were actually incredibly adaptable to whatever the situation on the ground required. My gut impression is they were terrible at other things, and I'll get to that as we go through the rest of this. But they were incredibly successful. And I don't think it's a stretch to claim that somehow or other, whatever the assessment was in July, it carried on. I don't think I've emphasized enough in this presentation. What I see is the tension that comes across in all the arguments about what happened after Smolensk. And specifically, here you've got this reference to the plain fact that the German victories of 1941 were among the greatest of all time. So they're just doing great. And Van Creveld goes on to literally say that the logistical solution that they adopted was probably the best balance they could. And yet, the page before, he's literally saying, there was no possibility of advancing earlier than they actually did from Smolensk to Moscow. And yet that was the plan, and that was what they prepared for. So how does that balance out? I mean, on the one hand, you're saying that the generals pretty much figured it out and found a balance that worked, but they couldn't possibly do what they planned to do. I mean, the parts where they were allowed to do what they intended seemed to work. So why would the Moscow move not work? Because let's be honest, the pressure to keep moving on that axis was extremely high. And it was only the fact that political authorities intervened that prevented that being carried out. Now, it may have been a disaster. I totally acknowledge that it could have failed, but that was the plan. And it certainly, no matter how you look at it, it makes more sense. But anyway, that's just what I want. I just wanted to point that out. I am trying to rehabilitate the German generals and kind of put Hitler down a notch, I guess, in this presentation. Sorry. While listing all these shortcomings, it's essential not to lose a sense of perspective. And this, I think everybody should be reading this line. Logistics form but one part of the art of war, and war itself is but one part of many forms that political relationships between human societies may assume. Something to keep in mind. It's part of it. I find it just, what is that very annoying saying, amateurs talk strategy and professionals talk logistics or something. I mean, you couldn't get a more irritating and foolish statement. I mean, logistics doesn't win a war. Okay? If it did, the Americans would have won in Afghanistan and Iraq, because frankly their logistics were so far superior that it's not even good, presentable. But anyway, this sentence is probably one of my favorites. Well, of course it fits my narrative, so I suppose big surprise that I like it. This war was lost on grounds other than logistic, including a doubtful strategy, which I agree. I mean, the fact is that a lot went wrong. A rickety structure of command. For anyone familiar with it, I mean, the German military command system was just bizarre. And to be fair about it, it was at least nominally viable in the form that it existed until the end of 1941. But once the commander-in-chief of the army had a heart attack or was forced out or whatever, the commander-in-chief of the OKH was Hitler, who therefore nominally reported to the Armed Forces High Command, OKW, who were subordinate to Hitler. So Hitler, in a sense, was reporting to himself after this. But I guess he had such a good relationship with the army that he felt that the only way to get control of them and prevent them from undermining whatever he wanted to accomplish on a given day was to take it over directly. And an unwarranted dispersion of scarce resources. See, again, there's a bit of tension there, because I find that I'd argue that the dispersion of scarce resources can be argued to have been the movements north and south, the lateral attacks by Army Panzer Groups 2 and 3 in September. That would qualify as a horrible waste of capability. And as one of the other authors points up, I mean, yes, those forces that were deployed north and south were weaker as a result, and therefore weakened the attack on Moscow. And regardless of a week or two, I think it was a lot more than I think you could fairly say there was at least a month that was delay that can be attributed to the movement of forces to the north and south, and then back again for the attack on for the later attack on Moscow. But you know, it depends on how you want to read it. And here's a dig at everyone who suggests that, well, maybe that was, you know, moving to attack, moving Guderian's Panzer Group 2 to the Ukraine for a campaign there was a mistake. And Creveld has the response that even the most important decision Hitler made during the campaign of 1941, namely the sending of Guderian into the Ukraine instead of towards Moscow, was justified on logistic grounds, and certainly had little to do with the postponement of the drive on the Russian capital. I have to wonder if Van Creveld is actually the originator of the argument that, yeah, it was all the logistics. But, you know, if you've read enough of the material, and I think I have, you just get this impression it's like Then if it was of no consequence, why is it such an important? Why is it discussed as such an important decision? Why is it that somebody like Style can note that it was almost universally opposed by the German generals? That what Hitler was proposing to do was against the plan. So you have to wonder, I mean, does that make sense? Because I don't think it does. But anyway, that's, you know, I'm sure there's people who feel otherwise, and feel free to leave comments explaining to me why I'm wrong, because somehow or other I just have yet to encounter a convincing response that explains how this logistical problem, which some people certainly some of the authors I've encountered confused with simply outrunning your supplies, which the German motorized forces did on a routine basis, and everyone was aware that that was a problem. But it had to do with the fact that part of the army was motorized, and Van Creveld makes the point. It was a poor army. It could not totally mechanize, and frankly, I mean, no other army, no army other than the United States Army was fully mechanized, and they had supply problems. So everybody has supply problems, but the question is, do you have enough to keep going? And can you keep going? Can you just keep pressing forward? Because keeping the enemy off balance is the whole point of the Blitzkrieg campaign. I think they did. They had that capability, but it was squandered. Feel free to argue otherwise. Without getting too speculative, I now want to point up how the attack toward Moscow played out. Most of the authors who take the position that the German generals were wrong and Hitler was right do so because they take for granted that the fall of Moscow would not lead to the collapse of the government or its surrender. In my opinion, while not proof either way, what was happening in October as the German advance on Moscow began again suggests the judgment of the German generals was sound, and the pattern seen in France would be repeated in the Soviet Union. There was a sense of panic among the political and bureaucratic elites, and that is certainly not support for any argument that claims Moscow didn't matter. There is good reason to believe that had the offensive operations towards Moscow begun more than a month earlier, as the generals had intended, the Germans would have reached Moscow and the government would have either collapsed or sought terms. I think the suggestion that Hitler was right or even reasonable in seeking resources in the south was a critical mistake. Tooze also talks about Typhoon, which was the Operation Typhoon was the offensive directed towards Moscow. And I'm just bringing it up here to keep in mind regarding how it played out in October 1941, when they ultimately were able to regroup and prepare for the drive on Moscow. At first, Typhoon satisfied every expectation. The Wehrmacht inflicted terrible wounds. 6 Soviet armies were engulfed in the double encirclement. 600,000 prisoners were trudged westwards. In the second week of October 1941, Stalin's regime came close to breaking point. It's actually very significant because let's try to put in perspective that if the argument I'm putting forward that they could begin at least a month earlier, this is middle September that we're talking about, and there's still a good campaigning month left. Following rumors that the communist leadership was fleeing the city, the population of Moscow briefly panicked. Yeah, it was more than a brief panic, and it wasn't some sort of, oh, they're coming or something. It was pretty close to regime collapse. Order, however, was soon restored. Stalin stayed in the capital, and General Georgy Zhukov managed to reconstruct one more defensive line. And, you know, that's kind of, I mean, we'll end there with Tooze, but I want to point out here that, that one more defensive line, again, was on forces that had just been gathered. I mean, they were feeding them into a meat grinder on the front. And their losses were absolutely stunning. And there was only so much calling up that could be done immediately, and I think that's part of the thing that's being ignored here. Is some of the forces that were available in October would have not even have been raised yet in September. I mean, it was literally like that. I mean, the Soviets were losing forces as quickly as they were gathering them, and that is why there's such a push to keep pressure on. I thought I'd provide a quote that is found in Joel Hayward, Hitler's Quest for Oil, the Impact of Economic Considerations on Military Strategy, 1941 to 42. He actually makes the same quote in another paper later. This one is published by the Journal of Strategic Studies in December 1995. It's not clear when the speech was given, but it was during the time of the Battle of Moscow taking place, possibly October or November of 1941. Anyway, Marshal Timoshenko, in a secret speech to the Supreme Defense Council in Moscow, said that if Germany succeeds in taking Moscow, that is obviously a grave disappointment for us, but it by no means disrupts our grand strategy. And you got to put this in the context of that there were literally riots in Moscow, and Soviet government officials and functionaries were in a state of panic. But yeah, taking Moscow isn't going to be a problem. Germany would gain accommodation, that is, shelter from the cruel Russian winter. But that alone will not win the war. The only thing that matters is oil. As we remember, Germany kept harping on her urgent oil problems in her economic bargaining with us from 1939 to 1941. So we have to do all we can, A, to make Germany increase her oil consumption, and B, to keep the German armies out of the Caucasus. He's more or less saying it's, well, because when you look at it, when you look at a map of that time frame, the Germans are very far from the Caucasus, but they're very close to Moscow. So it's no big deal if Moscow falls, but it would be a big deal if they could get to the Caucasus. But hey, look how far away they are from that. So we're winning. I think it's I previously described this as a feel-good statement, and one that reflects Soviet economic determinism. I mean, they were a communist historical materialism sort of government, and that's it. But it says something that they had to give a speech in which they're acknowledging, and that's what I think is really significant here, is that they're acknowledging that the threat to Moscow is very real. And that kind of indicates that, they were worried. If you look at other sources, such as what I'll look at next, it gives you a sense of just how close to the breaking point the Soviet government was. So here's a book that's by Jorg Baberowski, and it's titled Scorched Earth, Stalin's Reign of Terror. I pulled up a particular quote because I think it actually says a lot about the situation in October 1941, which, let's keep in mind, I mean, the Germans were in a position to advance in September, so if they had been advancing all that time, they probably would be approaching Moscow by this point. Whenever authority showed signs of weakness, power quickly waned. In October 1941, riots broke out among workers in the northeast of Moscow, in Ivanova, when party functionaries and factory directors tried to leave the city. In Zhytomyr and Berdichev, peasants took possession of the apartments that fleeing communist functionaries had left behind. And in Kherson, disgruntled city dwellers raided the bread factory and food warehouses after the NKVD had abandoned the city in panic. Years of pent-up rage exploded in one more orgy of violence. They destroyed, beat, pillaged, and plundered, recalled a witness to the riots in Kherson. Even in faraway Volgoda, the mood of the population was darkening. In January 1942, the Polish officer Gustav Herrling watched as women waited for bread in front of the state shops, complaining about the cuts in food rations and damning the war that had taken their husbands from them. Twice I even heard the whispered question, when are these Germans coming? Even in Moscow and Leningrad, the capitals of the revolution, the pressure on the regime was mounting. On October 15, 1941, with German troops just a few miles from Moscow, Stalin gave the order to evacuate the ministries from the capital, and panic ensued. Party functionaries, state officials, and factory directors hastily gathered their files and left Moscow in motorcades. Some communists burned their party membership cards before fleeing. Other Muscovites soon joined the exodus, forming long columns of people that could only inch along at a snail's pace down the main road to Ryazan. Probably more than a fifth of all residents abandoned the capital during these days. Andrei Sakharov, who was a student at Moscow University at the time, recalled the panic seizing the functionaries as the Germans approached. As office after office set fire to their files, clouds of soot swirled through the streets clogged with trucks, carts, and people on foot carrying household possessions, baggage, and young children. When Sakharov and other students gathered at the university to help organize its defense, the functionaries were already on their way out. I went with a few others to the party committee office, where we found the party secretary at his desk. When we asked whether there was anything useful we could do, he stared at us wildly and blurted out, "It's every man for himself." The Bolshevik mystique of the invincible perpetrator of violence was rapidly crumbling, and as the Bolsheviks' authority waned, so did the people's fear of them. In the center of Moscow, party functionaries trying to flee were attacked by pedestrians. In some factories, there were even reports of workers attacking and beating their managers and directors. Amid the chaos, looters soon took to the streets, raiding shops and stealing vehicles. According to NKVD agents, an angry mass of tens of thousands of people gathered in the center of Moscow and went about looting bread shops and kiosks. The militia had long since lost control of the situation. And I think we'll stop there. Well, basically because I don't have any more of it. But you know what? The point here is to give a sense of exactly what's going on at this point in time. And let's try to keep perspective without getting too speculative. I think it's very clear that the Germans had at least an additional month of time in which to carry out the offensive towards Moscow if they didn't go north and south. And so this imagery, and that's the reason this stuff is being presented, doesn't suggest that the Soviet government is going to survive. As a matter of fact, it suggests the Soviet government is rapidly collapsing. It really did look like a blitzkrieg could work on the Soviet Union. And that wouldn't be all that surprising because, again, as I said, it was a novel form of warfare. I've said this before. The novel aspect of it was what made it successful and allowed what was nothing much more than a tactic achieve strategic results, namely the surrender of governments and the demoralization of armies. And I think the Germans were actually very, very close. And the arguments against this tend to be rather weak. But that's my opinion. So that's about it for this argument. For those of you wondering why I haven't covered David Glantz, who does have a lot to say about this period, I would argue he simply presents the Soviet position, which emphasizes the threat to the flanks and the resistance of the Red Army as the basis of the explanation. It's not a new position, and John Erickson put the Soviet perspective on this forward in Road to Stalingrad back in 1975. The risk to the flanks was a calculated risk that the German generals accepted. Anyway, the point here has been to question the rather disparaging perspective that has been put forward more recently that suggests the German military leadership was something between incompetent and willfully ignorant of the situation at the front. They were not. They had a plan, and there is good reason to believe it was not only the best option available, but also the most likely to end the war in a timely and favorable manner. I hope my treatment of the books I've covered can be considered fair. If you don't think so, feel free to leave a comment that makes a counterpoint. So, for anyone who has watched this, thanks for your time. Please like and subscribe.